a marriage alliance between Britain and Rome, clarifying the sources. Given the apparent confirmation of a peace agreement between Britain and Rome following the invasion, further consideration must be given to the professed marriage alliance. Suetonius and Juvenal provide the only credible classical sources which mention Britain. However, traditionalists have confused the composition date of these two authors' works because of the subsequent and spurious accounts of Tacitus and Dio. Before examining the marriage alliance per se, clarity over the relevant sources and their composition dates is crucial. Suetonius recounts witnessing as a young boy the enforcement of Domitian's punitive poll tax on an elderly Jewish man. Considering that Domitian reigned from AD 81 to 96, we can presume that Suetonius was born between AD 70 to 90. Any earlier and his minority would have expired. Any later, and he would have been too young to form such a memory. Therefore, he evidently lived during and beyond Domitian's reign. Furthermore, he notes that after Domitian there was such an auspicious change through the justice and moderation of the succeeding emperors. This suggests that Suetonius also outlived Nerva, AD 96 to 98, and Trajan, AD 98 to 117. And the plurality of his statement allows us to presume that he died during or shortly after Hadrian's reign, AD 117 to 138. Beyond Suetonius's own corporal chronology, the subjects of his books are crucial in assigning an accurate composition date to both himself and his subjects. His Lives of the Caesars categorically focuses on the emperors of the Julio-Claudian and Flavian dynasties, all of whom are characteristically dead and separate from the Nerva-Antonine dynasty under which he was evidently composing his work. His Lives of the Poets biographed prominent poets who predated both himself and Domitian. It is apparent that all these particular poets lived, wrote, and died before Nero's reign was concluded. According to the biographer himself, Terence predated all the others, living between the termination of the Second Punic War and the commencement of the Third, during the latter half of the 2nd century BC. Juvenal reportedly mocked the favourites of Claudius and Nero and recited his work to crowded audiences with entire success. In fact, Suetonius categorically reports that it was this that incurred the suspicion of having covertly satirized occurrences which were then passing. And although 80 years old at that time, Juvenal was exiled to the extreme frontier of Egypt, a death sentence in all but name. Persius was an open critic of Nero, who died during the consulship of Rubrius Marius and Asinius Gallus, AD 62. His work was altered posthumously in order that it might not be supposed that it was meant to apply to Nero. Horace was a well-respected friend of Augustus and declared him as his heir. Lucan demonstrated himself as a genius in an encomium on Nero at the Quinquennial Games in AD 60. However, he soon fell from favour and set himself against the emperor. He was subsequently implicated as an active leader in Piso's conspiracy and was forced to commit suicide. There is no ambiguity whatsoever. Every poet biographed by Suetonius was dead before the conclusion of Nero's reign in AD 68. It is a well-documented fact that Nero regarded himself as an outstanding musician and actor who saw himself as a player. Suetonius reports that Juvenal had lambasted Nero's favourites, who were puffed up on account of unwarranted promotions. He goes on to explain that at that time the player was in high favour at court, and many of those who fawned upon him were daily raised to posts of honour. Ultimately, Juvenal fell foul for ridiculing both Nero and his favourites. He was reportedly exiled in his twilight years and most likely died before Nero's reign ended in AD 68. This timeline suggests that Juvenal was in fact born during Augustus's reign, circa 12 BC. Traditional dogma argues that Juvenal was writing much later than he in fact was. This comes from a misunderstanding of his statement. I shall be asked how I expect to escape the vengeance of those whom I satirize. Well, if I cannot show the names of the living, I must attack them under guise of the dead. According to Suetonius, it was Juvenal's failure to covertly satirize which saw him exiled to Egypt in his 80th year. Juvenal's coyness is expected and understandable, but nonetheless, his statement neither suggests nor proves that he was writing beyond the reign of Nero. Claudius and Nero are both mentioned by name several times, and Juvenal makes relevant references to them also. It is wrong to presume that every named individual in the satires is automatically an alias. Each time Claudius and Nero are explicitly mentioned, they are clearly not the butt of Juvenal's joke and required no disguise. However, the satirist conspicuously avoids naming the emperor who captured the Orkneys, and the emperor who subscribed to obscure oracles inferred from the condition of a fish. Similarly, when Juvenal attacked unscrupulous governors, who have made greater triumphs in time of peace than were ever made in time of war, he employed the guise of the dead, using the name Marius. Traditionalist assumptions have misrepresented Juvenal's Marius to be Marius Priscus. T.H.S. Escott explains that Juvenal's mention of the condemnation of Marius's links him to an event which occurred AD 100. Escott accepts that this is really the only sign in the satire which gives us certain knowledge as to its chronology. However, this is patently untrue. It is worth highlighting that this enlightening event, which Escott cites as certain knowledge, comes by way of the dubious discoveries of Tacitus during the Renaissance. Nevertheless, Juvenal's Marius appears twice in his satires, in Satire 1 and 8, and was specifically singled out because he represented governors who have made greater triumphs in time of peace than were ever made in time of war. Juvenal asks his audience not to despise Spain, Gaul, Illyricum, and Africa, because Marius has robbed all these. He is patently referring to Gaius Marius, famous for his Marian reforms circa 107 BC, who notoriously plundered all of the aforementioned regions. Gaius Marius stands alone as one who enjoyed 7 consulships, as well as multiple governorships, and remains as remarkable and recognizable today as he evidently was to Juvenal's audience. The creation of Tacitus, and especially his Agricola, have continued to fool traditionalists into assigning Juvenal's work to the end of Domitian's reign, or at the beginning of that of Nerva or of Trajan. This short-sighted assertion relies on Juvenal's reference to the Orkneys in his second satire, which the creator of Tacitus cynically lifted into a bogus biography of his protagonist's fictitious father-in-law. However, both Juvenal and the Brittonic source predate the farcical find of Tacitus in the 15th century. Moreover, both assign Rome's subjugation of the Orkneys to Claudius' reign and confirm it as valid satirical fodder for Juvenal. He rightfully ridicules Claudius's advance beyond the Irish coast, but categorically avoids naming Claudius, presumably because of his stated fear of vengeance. Nevertheless, Juvenal was clearly highlighting the unremarkable nature of the Orkney triumph. The glaring remoteness and irrelevance of the prize, compared to the British objective of Claudius's campaign, was perfect parody for Juvenal's scornful satire. Juvenal is equally abstract when directly mocking Nero. He, instead, addresses the emperor's astrologers and their obscure oracles, and patently avoids naming their player patron. Nonetheless, Satire 6 is clearly referring to Nero's reliance on divination, which is confirmed by Suetonius. The latter reports that astrologers told Nero that it would be his fortune to be at last deserted by all the world. But the greater part of them flattered him with assurances of being restored to his former fortune. And being most inclined to believe the latter prediction upon losing Britain, he imagined he had run through all the misfortunes which the fates had decreed him. Satire 4's unnamed emperor is advised to capture some royal, or Arivargus will slip from the British pole. The lampooned mystic is reputedly prophesying over the condition of a fish and supposing that it represents an inherent link between the British crown and Nero's destiny. Juvenal's reference links Nero to Arivargus, circa AD 65, and corroborates the chronology presented in the Brittonic source. According to the latter, Arivargus was still the reigning British king and still married to Claudius's daughter. It was this marriage alliance which apparently provided the evident peace which existed between Britain and Rome following the failed Claudian invasion. Identifying which of Claudius's daughters married Arivargus is simple enough, as he had but 2, Antonia and Octavia. The latter was an infant during Claudius's failed invasion and remained in Rome throughout her life. She saw her fiancé forced to commit suicide and was made to marry her adopted stepbrother Nero. Her apparent barrenness, subsequent divorce, and tragic execution in AD 62 are all reported by Suetonius. Antonia, on the other hand, was Claudius's eldest daughter and appears to have been born around AD 30. She was the only child of Claudius and his second wife, Aelia Paetina. Susan Wood confirms that Paetina was still a member of his family by the time he became emperor, and his daughter Antonia, for whom he arranged politically advantageous marriages, occasionally appears on provincial coinages. Nevertheless, and besides the 2 sentences provided by Suetonius, Antonia appears completely absent from certifiable literary evidence. Suetonius's initial and succinct report has Claudius arranging her marriage to Cneius Pompey the Great and afterwards to Faustus Sylla, both youths of very noble parentage. Antonia appears only once more in Nero, when she refused to marry him, Nero, after the death of Poppaea in AD 65. She was resultantly put to death under the pretenses of being involved in a plot. The conspicuous absence of information on Antonia and her exceptionally well-bred fiancés is remarkable. She was the sole scion of the Julio-Claudian bloodline before the birth of Britannicus and Octavia, circa AD 40, and again after their untimely deaths in AD 55 and 62. According to Suetonius, Antonia's first fiancé was stabbed to death, while her second only appeared as a name and was never revisited in any capacity by the biographer. Nonetheless, their description as noble youths confirms their minority and suggests Antonia's at the time when these particular matches were made. Both appear as direct descendants of Pompey the Great through his only daughter, Pompeia. Faustus Sulla's name suggests that he came via Pompeia's first marriage to the son of the dictator Sulla, Senator Faustus Cornelius Sulla. As a result, both youths' pedigrees placed them in contention with the two surviving Augustan lines, both of which were concurrently competing for Claudius's youngest daughter's hand. The Augustan line had survived through Julia the Elder, but had effectively divided through her daughters, Agrippina the Elder and Julia the Younger. Suetonius reports that Claudius contracted his younger daughter Octavia to Lucius Silanus, son of Aemilia Lepida, Julia the Younger's daughter. However, during the mid-40s AD, Agrippina the Younger, who was of the opposing Augustan branch, began to significantly influence Claudius. Ultimately, she convinced Claudius to cut off Silanus, adopt Nero, and allow him to marry Octavia instead. Unsatisfied with this alone, Agrippina successfully lobbied Claudius to have Silanus commit suicide as a spectacle on their wedding day. Agrippina's cynical maneuverings successfully secured her Augustan line's predominance by extinguishing all opposing claimants. However, her success was ultimately marred by Nero's subsequent failure to produce a successor, which invited the year of the four emperors and the extinction of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. In the years which followed Agrippina's death in AD 59, Nero ultimately became disgusted with Octavia and ceased from having any intercourse with her, and being censured by his friends for it, he replied that she ought to be satisfied with having the rank and appendages of his wife. Soon afterwards, Nero made several attempts, but in vain, to strangle her, and then divorced her for barrenness, and at last put her to death upon a charge of adultery so impudent and false. 12 days after the divorce, Nero married Poppaea Sabina. She was unremarkably bred, but, nonetheless, Nero entertained a great affection towards her. Their only child died in infancy, and subsequently Poppaea succumbed to a fatal kick which Nero gave her when she was big with child. After her death in AD 65, clarity over the impending curtailment of the Claudian line appears to have befallen Nero. He sought to remedy this calamity by capturing Claudius's only surviving daughter, Antonia, in marriage. However, she refused him and suffered execution, under the pretense of her being engaged in a plot against him. His indignant and fatal reaction to Antonia's rejection ultimately sacrificed the Julio-Claudian succession. However, and more importantly, Nero's actions towards Antonia corroborate the astrological advice which Suetonius reported and Juvenal specifically satirized. Re-examining Juvenal's contribution. Suetonius's Lives of the Poets confirms that Juvenal was a contemporary critic of Nero. His Lives of the Caesars also reports, in Nero, that the emperor gave credence to his astrologer's advice, specifically regarding Britain. Predominantly because of traditionalists' miscalculation of Juvenal's composition date, Satire 4 has been mistranslated and misunderstood. Moreover, the information provided by both Juvenal and Suetonius corroborates and confirms that which is provided by the Brittonic source. The latter professes that Arivagus became the British king during the Claudian invasion and accepted a daughter of Claudius as part of the peace settlement which followed the failed invasion. The same source states that Arivagus remained king until at least the reign of Vespasian. His son, Myric, apparently succeeded him, while his grandson, Coel, continued the dynasty. The latter reportedly spent time in Rome during his minority, as his great-grandfather Cinvelin had done a century earlier. Nevertheless, the entire premise of each Roman invasion was to secure a stake in Britain and its lucrative international trade. The actions of Afarwi, which concluded the Caesarian invasions and the subsequently confused allegiance of Cinvelin, did not provide such a stake. However, Claudius's magnanimous marriage alliance did, by successfully conjoining the ruling families of both powers. The subsequent arrival of Agrippina, her marriage to Claudius, and his adoption of Nero changed the dynamics of this agreement significantly. Her cynical lobbying of Claudius and positioning of Nero sought to supplant any arrangement with Ariovargus. However, this plan was floundering by AD 65. When Juvenal satirized the unnamed emperor's plan to capture some royal, or Ariovargus will slip from the British pole, Nero was without a wife, child, or successor. His only remaining relation was his stepsister Antonia, Claudius's eldest daughter and queen to Ariovargus, the sole scion of the Julio-Claudian bloodline. It requires little imagination to comprehend the implications of Nero's plan. It threatened both the marriage alliance and the monopoly which Claudius had miraculously managed to arrange. Nonetheless, Nero was evidently far more concerned with his personal succession issue. He recognized that the remedy lay in the last remnant of the Julio-Claudian bloodline, Antonia. By capturing her in marriage, Nero could save and perpetuate the dynasty. By AD 65, Antonia held the only legitimate claim, and her offspring, whether conceived or adopted by Nero, would secure dynastic continuance. Knowing that both Juvenal and Ariovargus were contemporaries to Nero, the former's fourth satire becomes remarkably clear and concise rather than abstract and obscure. Regem alicem capies, aut de timone Britanno excidet Ariovargus, literally translated as capture some royal, or Ariovargus will slip from the British pole. Traditionalists' translation of Juvenal's timone assumes it to mean the beam of a plough or the draft tree of a chariot. However, this is inaccurate and misleading. In fact, timone simply refers to a wooden pole or beam. A variety of examples and uses of the word are provided by Alexander Adam in his A Compendious Dictionary of the Latin Tongue. Nevertheless, Charles R. Swindoll provides the most intriguing and contextually relevant use of the pole by Romans. Swindoll informs on their adoption of the archaic Persian practice of hanging people from a pole, describing how a stake was thrust into the body and hung upon a pole or a tree. Subsequently, the Romans adapted this into what we commonly refer to as crucifixion. Sextus Propertius, Josephus, Isidore, and many biblical references provide confirmation. Kiefer, more recently, tells of the Romans' imaginative use of the pole or beam to torture and to kill. The patibulum was one such device, which was a divided log of wood that fastened around the neck of the unfortunate. The hands were then attached by rope or nail to the ends of the beam, and the victim hoisted hanging from the beam onto a pole planted in the earth. The Timone Britanno, or British pole, was the marriage alliance forged by Claudius between Ariovargus and his eldest daughter. It conjoined and effectively contracted Britain to Rome and provided the latter with a latent logistical monopoly on British trade. However, Nero's continuing failure to secure a successor inadvertently reversed the presupposed advantages of Claudius's marriage alliance of AD 43. It effectively revived Antonia's predominant position in Rome's imperial family. However, and because she was concurrently wife and queen to Ariovargus, this eventuality jeopardized Rome's lucrative trade arrangement with Britain, and worse still, threatened to gift the entire empire to Ariovargus. The astrological advice reported by Juvenal forewarned Nero of this perilous predicament and suggested the capture of some royal. Despite appearing abstract and unspecific, Juvenal is patently pointing towards a particular royal individual. A royal who is fundamentally connected to Ariovargus, but who is clearly not the king himself. A royal whose capture served Nero's specific successional need. Juvenal is typically cautious in not naming Nero or Antonia, but does provide Ariovargus. His anecdote provides for only one eventuality. The proposed target is the queen of Ariovargus, Antonia. Suetonius confirms Nero's adherence to the advice and the consequence of his actions. He reports that Antonia rejected Nero's proposal and suffered fatally for it. Suetonius draws no link, but explicitly concludes that Nero concurrently lost Britain. Antonia's death unequivocally ended the Julio-Claudian bloodline, severed Rome's regal relationship with Britain, and triggered a year-long struggle for supremacy in the succession. Vespasian was the fourth and final emperor of that tumultuous year. The first three emperors, who came and went in as many seasons that year, conspicuously broke any surviving connection to Claudian claimants and enabled the fledgling Flavian dynasty to sow its imperial seed in virgin ground.